Okay, so Blizzard carefully watched last week's video that we made, Dratnos, and decided that they were in fact going to pull the trigger on nerfing a bunch of these bosses, even after we talked about the pros and the cons of nerfing them.
Yeah, so we actually have one of the larger sweeps of balance changes to M Plus coming in here.
2 days worth.
Series, yeah.
So there was some on January 6th and some on January 3rd. So we have two completely separate sets of dungeon nerfs. So we're going to talk through the nerfs, talk about were they too heavy-handed in some instances, and kind of give like a nuanced approach to it. Again, like kind of an extension of the conversation that we were having last week about just how they should be looking to nerf dungeons just in general, especially with how this season is shaking up.
Yeah, so this is, I believe, the second set of changes that we're looking at here, right? Or is this the first one?
Either
way, this is the
second
one
set of changes. This is the second set of changes.
Yeah. Because this is the one that improved the visual clarity of the Advisor Melandris, but they also substantially nerfed Advisor Melandris in the first set of changes.
Okay, so let's take a look at the first set of changes then. Okay. So they hit Overgrown Ancient a little bit. Actually, the changes, it reads as a little bit, but it actually ends up being a pretty substantial amount. They changed the cadence of Overgrown Ancient and how often you get the burst forth relative to the branch cast. Seems like it is a pretty substantial nerf. Azure Blade, it takes time between Azure Blade to drain their mana, so you're getting less of the intermission casts. Do you know the timing on that? I read something about it.
I think 20% more time in up phases.
Okay, that's good. There's some stuff with the Knockhood, Granith, Knockhood Lancemasters are less talkative with Fire the Missile.
Yeah, they're not. Let fly! Let fly! That's gone. Sad.
So sad. Raging Tempest nerfs.
Yeah, so this works out to be... Oh, I guess this is a different set of nerfs than the second one, but yeah. Slight nerfs to it, and the 15 to 18 seconds actually makes it quite a bit easier to extend your 10 stack as well.
This is way easier, like especially... So again, if you want a great tip for doing this dungeon, make sure you have 10 stack on your healer as often as possible. It's going to make it substantially easier for you to be able to heal like through the electrical storms. So... And with this, it's easier for them to maintain a 10 stack now.
I think that the Raging Tempest boss in particular, if you had to like ask people what boss they wiped to the most, that boss is probably pretty high up there for a lot of people. So I think it was probably a good one to target.
It's weird because it was a boss that I think that we brought it up is like, is this boss actually the most difficult boss of the expansion, or are people playing it incorrectly? Because it's a lot more nuanced than, because this fight is like, it's one that people at high keys, they're able to do this on a 23 or a 24, and they're able to get through it, and they're not getting completely walled by this guy. But they're doing it by basically playing perfect and making sure that their healer has a 10 stack permanently. Whereas, like, and I've been in this situation, in like a 15 or a 16, my healer is not maintaining stacks of the buff at all, and it's impossible to heal.
Yeah, I think probably a good target to nerf, just based on like how many like pug runs ended on that boss. So
yeah.
Seemed reasonable to me.
Tira Maruk. Now this has so basically the Gale arrows, the little arrow that would go over your head and it would shoot the tornadoes out of it, and you would take like 60% of your damage, 60% of your health and damage. They added a slight delay on quick shot. It used to be 0.2 seconds after the Gale arrow, the first quick shot would come out. Now it's 4 seconds, and so your healer is able to get people topped a little bit higher to allow them to not get just completely one shot by the boss.
Yeah, then we saw Ruby Life Pools getting some nerfs to first and third boss, although I would say not nerfs to the hard parts of either of those fights. I guess the nerf to the AoE damage of Chillstorm is definitely very relevant.
I think the Chillstorm nerf is probably one of the hardest parts, although the tank damage on this fight is still really, really tough.
Yeah, although reducing the Chillstorm AoE does help your tank, because that hit them as well, and also it means that your healer will now be able to put an extra global into them, probably. Yeah,
the last boss, I mean, this isn't too much. This is a big QOL change. Like 2 seconds on school lockout's totally fine. Storm Slam now casts less frequently. I think that this isn't that big of a deal. I think that if you're getting locked out on this fight, like if your healer was already getting locked, you're probably looking to die anyways.
Yeah, this reduces the chance of that, which is good, especially in the 15 key range, which I think is welcome.
Lesser Shah and Malform Shah's ability, Shah Eruption now ignores line of sight. This could allow for some nice, interesting techniques where you're tanking the big mini boss on the corner, and whenever the Lesser Shah or the Malform Shah are looking to die, you kind of line of sight. This is good for like raging weeks, because we know that raging Shahs were deadly, but I don't know. I think that this is just like a good QOL change, and it allows for a little bit more outplay.
Yeah, things I think generally should be line of sightable unless like a line of sight strategy completely breaks them. But it's very counterintuitive to try and line a mob that seems like it should be lineable and then just get one shot anyways from around a corner. So I think that's good.
These are some. I mean, these are all trash nerfs. Shoved out. Increase the recast cooldown of touch and nothingness. This is a tank killer, isn't it, from the Shaw?
No, this is the 2 AoE.
Oh no, this is the boss. This is the boss, isn't this? This is not the trash Shaw.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, this is the AoE circles. So they basically only force you to get 2 of the AoE circles per phase, as opposed to 3 and 4 sometimes that you would get before. And the Wither Will is the random AoE damage, and it now prefers targets that are not under the effects of touch and nothingness. I was getting hit for like 100k of this Wither Will while having the touch and nothingness before. Thank God that they made this change. These are good QOL changes. I feel like
it's actually interesting now because like you're kind of in most danger of dying right after you get dispelled, right? You're still low, and then you're now an eligible target again. So that's time to watch out.
I think that overall these are fairly solid changes. I think that like most of them are just like smart ways of nerfing bosses. None of them are just like, oh yeah, we nerfed this thing by 75%. A lot of them are just like really interesting ways.
Yeah, I do think they've targeted hard bosses and nerfed them well here. A lot of them are like healing check bosses that are now less of healing checks, but I don't know. I'm kind of torn because like on the one end, I think that it's a lot of healers, especially like high key healers that are playing good specs in good groups with DPS players that hit defensives, right? Like those players liked it when their bosses were hard and interesting, right?
Yeah,
but it's like, okay, how do you make a boss fight that a player on a Preservation Evoker or a Resto Druid in a 22 with DPS that are health potting and using their defensives, like that is it's so hard to make a encounter that's going to be challenging for those healers and not just completely impossible for a Resto Shaman and a Pug 15, right?
I mean, I think that talking about like are these nerfs too heavy-handed is definitely a very interesting point. I mean, we see these tweets. We saw a couple of community tweets. This one from Yoda. I think that this is a bit more extremist than I would necessarily say. At this point, just 4 DPS keys, what's the point of making healing checks if you're going to give in 3 weeks in the season? I don't feel like these nerfs are that large. Like, I do think that some of the changes that we saw, at least in this first section, were fairly large, but they weren't like, oh my god, these make the bosses just totally free. One of the things that we also saw in the first round of nerfs that wasn't on that blue post was Advisor Melandris getting a substantial nerf as well. Reducing the slicing maelstrom damage by 44%, which I mean, so
well, in total, it's like a 34% nerf, right? If you if you are doing it right, and less if you were doing it wrong, or no, it was if you were getting targeted, if you were standing in melee of the boss, and it was less of a nerf if you were already standing out of range of the boss. Yeah.
And then I mean, JB also kind of had a meme tweet, but I think that this is actually probably how he feels about it. It's not that fair that Blizzard keep making healing checks easy so that only DPS and tanks get to deplete keys by being bad. I mean, so I think that like part of this is definitely him joking, but at the same time, it's like, what is healer's role in dungeons, right? Like I think that on the whole, Blizzard has made healing checks inside of a lot of these keys in Dragonflight significantly more difficult. There are very few bosses. Wise Mary, I think, in Temple of the Jade Serpent is the only one I can really think of where healers are just supposed to do damage the whole entire time. A lot of these fights have pretty significant healing checks in some form or the other.
Yeah, I mean, this to me, it just kind of goes back to how do you make a healing check that will be interesting for JB and doable for a Resto Shaman and a Pug 15.
Yeah,
and I actually think the biggest culprit here is just how different some of the healing specs are. Like the difference between Resto Druid and Resto Shaman in key pushing right now makes it so that like JB with his DPS pressing defensives and his more skilled play and his much better spec, like if it was just 2 of those 3 things instead of all 3 of those 3 things, I think you could make the healing checks scale based on the key level and that would be enough. But the way it is right now, that's not enough. It's not enough there. So I think there's a serious class balance culprit hiding here with especially stuff like Resto Shaman, and Resto Shaman should be able to heal 15s and stuff. That should be less hard than it currently is.
I think
these nerfs are warranted.
Yeah, I think let's hit the other nerfs real quick. Improved visual clarity for Piercing Gale and Advisor Melandris. That's
now it's like a purple
damage
line.
Yeah, it's a purple line. I think that was the biggest issue with Advisor Melandris. Is just like it was very hard to see Piercing Gale and the circles. Tectonic stomps area of effect now correctly matches the visual on all difficulties. Great. So then they also bug fix Raging Tempest.
Yeah.
Basically, Raging Tempest's orbs were not scaling at all. They were only doing like 16k damage per hit. And then I was sitting there and I heard that they were bugged, and I was looking at them and I was like, oh my god, if they actually buffed these things and made them scale properly, we'd be getting hit for like 90k per orb. And so they nerfed them by 80%, and they were like, wait a second, this was not intended. And so now it's a nerf to the Raging Tempest orbs on anything below a 20 and a slight buff on anything above a 20. This seems pretty fair.
Yeah, I mean, mechanics should scale with key level, right? Like,
yeah, mechanics should scale with
mechanics that are locked to M0 or whatever, obviously is bad. But also the fact that it was still a scary mechanic even on the M0 scaling, yeah, it's good that they nerfed it as well as doing that.
Okay, just Thunderhead, weird damage to Guardians and stuff like that getting changed. And then, they kind of buff Shadow Moon Burial Grounds in a couple of different ways. I actually wouldn't mind if they... What are the Dominators? Are those the mobs that channel Dominate Mind on the mobs?
Yeah, on the NPCs. Yeah.
I wouldn't mind if those got changed as well to be fixed. This boss, by the way, Ner'zhul, with the Ritual of Bones, now the not scaling, like they changed it to scale with key level. I would prefer a hitbox update as well on the Ritual of Bones, because it's very easy to accidentally get clipped by this and die. They changed it to scale with key level, but now it's like one shot 200 to 0.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a 15-second dot. It doesn't go away when the wall goes away anymore. Like you are going to die if you take that dot in a high key, and that's I think that is fair, but it should involve a fair hitbox as well.
Okay, I think that all of those are pretty reasonable. So let's talk about something else. So we talked about where the nerfs are a little bit too heavy-handed in some instances. Would you think that there's something a little bit more nuanced to it, where it's like there's not parity among healers? That could be a result of this. I think that there's an issue of dungeon of parity among the nerfs as well.
Yeah.
So I think that, and let me present this argument. I don't know if Advisor Melandris should have been nerfed purely based off the instance of like, this dungeon is too easy. A lot of the primary difficulty in Court of Stars is dictated by the second Talixay Flame Wreath and third Advisor Melandris bosses. Very infrequently you're going to deplete this key based off of timer. Very infrequently you're going to deplete this key based off of anything that's not wiping to the final two bosses. And so then that is a question of, should you be nerfing this dungeon because this dungeon is too easy? And I think that there is a major issue whenever Court of Stars and Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, and again, this is like an extension of the conversation that we had last week, where these two dungeons are far too easy compared to the other dungeons. And there is an issue of whenever you're nerfing Advisor Melandris, which is almost an objectively very hard boss relative to the other bosses in Dragonflight dungeons, but like the dungeon itself is too easy. So what are you supposed to do at that point?
Yeah, I do think this is a serious problem, and I don't know what the right answer is, because like, yeah, objectively, Advisor Melandris was on the harder side of bosses by quite a bit. Like you could, there were a lot of groups that would just get kind of brick walled by Advisor Melandris, especially on Tyrannical weeks, right? And especially back on Tyrannical Grievous week, right, where your healer's just like, I can't do this boss, right? And it's like, okay, well, if the rest of the dungeon's easy, does that justify having a really hard end boss, or should they still nerf that? And I think, like, ideally, we would go back in time and we'd have, like, more deadly trash in Court of Stars, right? Like, the rest of the place. Obviously, there is some deadly trash in the dungeon. There are groups that wipe to the trash, but there's a lot of trash there that, like, okay, one AoE stun handles this trash, right? You put 2 kicks on this mob, and the other mobs in this pack don't do anything, right? Like those sorts of trash packs fill Court of Stars for coordinated groups, and yeah, ideally that wouldn't be true, but I don't think you can go back in really and buff that aspect of Court of Stars, right?
I think that something you said last week, I think, resonated with me super hard. I don't know if they can or will be willing to pull the trigger on buffing dungeons in any meaningful capacity. And it's like, this is a dungeon too. Advisor Melandris, the difference in if you have good buffs for the boss or not is also massive. So say if you have the Starlight Rose Brew, which is 3% health per 3 seconds, or and in conjunction with like the food buff, which is 25% total HP. Those are massive, like, at being able to kill through Talixay and Melandris fairly easily relative to not having those two things together.
Yeah, it's tough because, like, I think that the best path forward from here is probably to just continue nerfing all of the other dungeons until there is parity, because I do think dungeon parity is an important goal. But I think the best thing to have done would have been to have Court of Stars and Shadow Moon be buffed during PTR or beta or whatever. But failing that, I think it is really bad for, you know, you get a 19 key or whatever. If it's Shadow and Burial Grounds, it's 2 chests. If it's Azure Vault, it's probably depleted. Like there are a lot of groups for whom there are key levels where Shadow and Burial Grounds is a 2 chest, Court of Stars is in time, and Azure Vault is depleted, for instance, right? Like that is not a good. It's not good to have whether you time the key be something that you kind of know based on what dungeon it rolls, rather than like, okay, we zone in and how well we play it, right?
I don't generally like the difficulty of Court of Stars and Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, so they feel too easy. Like even just playing them, it's like Shadow Moon has an issue of it's not deadly enough, and I think that's a major issue with that. Court of Stars at least feels like a full dungeon in a different way. Like it does feel like some of the trash is deadly, but it feels like there are obviously pretty easy ways to mitigate it. And there's like a big timer issue in Court where you're like blasting it 10 minutes ahead of the timer or something like that. I don't know, man. I feel like if they nerfed the dungeons to where they were all equal parity to Court of Stars and Shadow Moon, that would also be like a pretty big issue because those dungeons are so easy.
Yeah, I don't think you can go in and like make a mob more deadly than it was last week without it feeling really bad. So I legitimately don't know the answer to this one, what they should do or anything like that. And I also don't know like how you make sure that it's fair for people that aren't just pushing super high keys. I guess I do think that one thing they could do for at least the like rank 1 title push problems that this creates is nerf how much score you get from depleted keys, and maybe only at the high end, like maybe only above 20 or something like that. But if you just drop that by a key level or 2, that would make it a little bit less about just rolling until you get Shadow and Burial Grounds and then weekly no levering, whatever it turns into. Like that play pattern I think is pretty bad and should be destroyed.
Yeah. Okay. I think the last little thing is: are there any other nerfs you'd like to still see in dungeons?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think like Azure Vault, Trash and Bosses. There's still some candidates in there.
Okay.
I don't know where else I would necessarily call for them. Maybe Temple of Jade Serpent still, just on some of the way that dungeon operates is like. That's pretty different than a lot of the other ones.
The little bit of the Trash and Jade Serpent, maybe reduce recast timing on some of the trash.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like I don't really have specific nerfs because the problem feels less like, oh, this one part of these dungeons is way harder than the hardest part of like Court of Stars, right? It's more just like, oh, this dungeon has like 50 medium difficulty moments and Court of Stars only has like 2.
Yeah, I'm not even necessarily funnily enough, I don't even think that. I think that some of the Dragonflight dungeons are hard. I think that Ruby Life Pools is a challenging dungeon. I think Knockout Offensive is a challenging dungeon.
I would call for some Ruby Life Pools upstairs trash nerfs, actually. I would like Cinder Bolts, make it so that they stack a damage taken increase on you or whatever. So if you get hit by 2 of them, you die, but you don't just die to the first one.
The Inferno on the from the LAs too. Yeah, that stuff is ridiculous. I'm not saying that these dungeons aren't hard. I'm saying that like on average, these dungeons are close to where M+ should be in terms of difficulty, and they can get nerfed into line. And then the like Shadow Moon and Court of Stars are very far off of where, at least in my mind, I think dungeons should be. I think that like on average, like the difficulty of dungeons should be, I don't even know, like what, like Halls of Valor seems like it's pretty in line where it's like, okay, you need to double pull some trash packs, otherwise you're going to be up against the timer pretty hard. But a lot of the trash packs that you need to double pull to be able to time this key are double pullable. It's like pretty reasonable to me, and so the difficulty is actually fairly difficult. The bosses, while not oppressively deadly, can be deadly at times, but overall that dungeon feels more or less in line with about the difficulty I expect from doing this dungeon on a 15, a 20, even that kind of range. Although I wouldn't hate a nerf to Fenrir. That boss kind of is annoying in some aspects.
Yeah, I think maybe like Runic Brand dot damage on Odin as well would be something that a lot of groups would appreciate. But that's nitpick, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're at this point we're just kind of nitpicking things, but at the same point, it's like there's such a big issue with the season whenever there are parity issues, and I was actually super hyped to see these dungeons return, and now it's just kind of being overwashed by like having the dungeons be too easy, and so the conversation is like, oh yeah, did your dungeon turn into Shadow Moon Burial Grounds or Court of Stars, or did it turn into Ruby Life Pools?
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Again, I'm not sure it's necessarily a problem that they even have good tools to solve is the thing. Like this is not one of the cases where like I have a proposal that I think would be like, I don't even know.
Would you ever accept a buff? Would you ever accept a mid-season dungeon buff?
I would, yeah, but I don't know if like the player base as a whole would. I think that would be something I would definitely be looking at doing, but like that, I understand why that's something they would be really hesitant to do. If they do something like that, I will probably be one of the voices trying to defend it, but I suspect it will be pretty unpopular.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like I don't even know how they, without completely reworking Shadowman, I don't even know exactly how they would even make that dungeon more deadly. Obviously, making the Dominators not permanently channel and actually have to cast and like kick Rending Void Lash and kick Dominate Mind would be a good start. You know, that seems like a good start of making some of the trash packs a little bit more deadly. But I don't know, that doesn't fix that dungeon either, though.
Yeah, because it's not like there aren't like it's not like they could just buff how much damage some of these. Some of these mechanics do. You're good. It's not like they could just buff how much damage like the Void Pulse does or whatever. Like that just will kill you at a lower key level, or like that's not the way to buff that dungeon, right? It's like you need mechanical interestingness.
Yeah, I mean, we complain sometimes about how many mechanics that knockout offensive trash has. Like, I think that I would go out on a limb and say that in my personal belief, the knockout offensive trash has too many mechanics generally. Shadow Moon Burial Grounds is like on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's got way too few mechanics on a lot of their trash.
Yeah, and I know a lot of like M+ers I talk to actually quite like that idea in theory, but I think the problem comes when then, okay, your key can either roll this or it can roll another one. That creates some.
I mean, if there was parity, it would be
patterns.
If there was parity, it would be totally fine, because then at least at that point you're not running into like a. I mean, we had this in the last season of BFA, if you remember, where like what were the dungeons that were super? It was like Siege of Borealis. Yeah, it was like Siege of Borealis was like unbelievably hard. King's Rest was unbelievably hard, and then you had Toldagor and Junkyard that were able to be done at 5 key levels higher or something ridiculous. And I feel like we're definitely in the same spot where it's like we already have people do 25s and 26s because they high rolled their literally had
back to back flip ping pong between Court of Stars and Shadow and Burial Grounds, and that key goes all the way up.
You know what's funny? I did a 20 Halls of Valor this week. We two chested it, and then it rolled into a Court of Stars, which we two chested the 22 Court of Stars into a 24 Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, which we one chested into a 25 Court of Stars.
Whew.
It was so dumb.
That's a good run. That's a good run of Keystones.
And the fact that that can happen to somebody like me who doesn't deserve to be able to do a 25 is outrageous.
Yeah, I do worry that like end of season, like who gets title, who has the high scores is going to be largely based on either who gets lucky or plays enough that they just kind of force that luck to eventually happen, right? And that's like,
yeah,
like obviously playing more is always going to be good, but it doesn't need to be this good.
Okay.
Right? It doesn't need to be that good. I don't know.
Just a bit of a summary. Are we happy? We happy with the nerfs overall? I think that everything that I saw in the nerfs were like pretty reasonable, and a lot of the changes weren't like flat damage nerfs. They were like big QOL updates to make sure that you're not getting one shot outside of mechanics and stuff like that. Like I think the Terra Maruk one is a great change.
Yeah, while I empathize with healers wanting to heal, the like healers I know that want to heal more, I do think that these changes in general were pretty warranted.
I think that everything they need to be. I think that like something that they need to be aware of as well is like not every boss should be Heartsbane Triad level of difficulty where it's like, oh my god, this is a ridiculous fight for healers and they're not really able to heal it.
Yeah, just like, are we going to move to a season where there's no hard healer checks? Is that good? I don't know.
Well, last expansion we had very few hard healer checks outside of like Sanguine Depths, right? Like every other dungeon was like pretty lax. And I think that moving into a direction where there are more, at least a couple per dungeon, very difficult healer checks is important. I think that overall is kind of an extension of our last video. It's like the dungeon parity is just like way out of balance, and then that becomes complicated.
Yeah, it's a problem for which there are not easy solutions if you don't think that all the other dungeons need nerfs, which we kind of don't, right?
Yeah, like I don't think that like Azure Vault needs a nerf, but like, does Azure Vault relative to Court of Stars need a nerf? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. That's it. That's it for our video. Let us know what you think. If you're, I don't know. Also, like obviously, we have a limited perspective on dungeons. So if you're hearing us talk about certain dungeons and mechanics being hard, and your experience is complete opposite, let us know in the comments.
I think that's an interesting point because everybody's experience is like super unique.
Yeah, depending on what key level you're doing, what your group is, whether you're pugging or in a coordinated group, different bosses and different trash bowls become the hard part of the dungeon, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll be back next week. Maybe talk about 10.0.5 stuff. I don't know exactly what we're going to hit next week. We'll hit something interesting, another community topic perhaps. And we will see you guys in next week's video.